Hello, fellow teachers. This is Ben Wilcox, and I want to welcome you to this supplemental teaching activities video for Doctrine and Covenants, sections 85 through 87. Remember that the purpose of these videos isn't to focus on commentary or insight, but to give you ideas, activities, and questions that you might consider using if you're teaching a Come Follow Me lesson this week. Also, the idea isn't to use every slide and every question and every activity, but to pick and choose the ones that you feel are best suited to the needs of your students and your time frame. With that all being said, let's get started. Lesson number 1. Steady yourself and not the ark. Truth: when I seek to counsel God or His appointed leaders, even with good intentions, I put myself in danger of spiritual death. To help you get some fire in the bones for this lesson, realize that the truth this lesson teaches can help your students to confront one of the more subtle and spiritually dangerous temptations that Satan typically employs against disciples of Christ. We live in a time when personal opinion is often elevated above all else, and questioning authority is even praised as a virtue. Hopefully, this lesson can serve as a reminder of the vital importance of humility and trust in God and His wisdom rather than our own. We've got an opportunity here to invite our students to strengthen their faith in divine authority rather than assuming control over God's work. And for an object, you could purchase a small replica of the Ark of the Covenant. And I was actually surprised to see how inexpensive these are on Amazon. Now, these aren't going to be super high quality and they're kind of small, but it still gives your students an idea of what the Ark of the Covenant would have looked like. Now, you could also place a do not touch sign on your model for dramatic effect. And if somebody does decide to touch it anyway, even better, because you can use that as an illustration of our natural human tendency to push boundaries, to question authority, to flout the rules. Now, I actually have a life-size model of the Ark of the Covenant that I built years ago. And for this lesson, I place it at the front with that sign on it. And almost inevitably, somebody touches it anyway. I mean, I teach teenagers, so factor that into the equation. But if you wish not to make that purchase, you could always just display a picture of the Ark of the Covenant. But for the icebreaker, show your students the following pictures and ask them to consider what would happen if they decided to touch those items. And the items are poison ivy, sulfuric acid, a hot stove, a cactus, an electrical fence, the crown jewels, and then finally, the Ark of the Covenant. You could make the point that touching certain things has natural consequences. And then explain that the Israelites were given some very specific rules as to their handling of the ark. Unless you were specifically authorized to move or handle it, it was strictly forbidden to touch. As the sacred container of the tablets of the Ten Commandments, the ark represented the presence of God. And the message behind that, I believe, was to communicate the principle that no unclean thing could dwell in the presence of God. And nobody was permitted to touch the ark, and only the Levites were authorized to carry it. And that was only with sticks that were attached by rings to the outer corners. Even the Levites weren't permitted to touch the actual ark itself. Now, with that in mind, inform your students that there's a verse in section 85 of the Doctrine and Covenants that refers to an Old Testament story that features the Ark of the Covenant. And who can be the first person to find that verse? And that'll prompt your students to open their scriptures, and somebody's going to find it fairly quickly. The verse is verse 8. You have somebody read it aloud. It says, "While that man who was called of God and appointed, that putteth forth his hand to steady the ark of God, shall fall by the shaft of death, like as a tree that is smitten by the vivid shaft of lightning." Now tell your students that that verse is going to be the focus of the day's lesson, but that you want them to understand the context, the historical background. Section 85 was directed to a man named William W. Phelps, who was a leader of the church in Zion in Jackson County. And those members of the church that were called to move there were given inheritances or parcels of land, but they needed to be willing to live the law of consecration in that area. Unfortunately, there were members of the church who had settled in Zion without official authorization to do so, and who weren't willing to live the law of consecration as instructed. There were also some who had initially made the commitment to live it, received their inheritances, but then backed out of their commitments, or they'd apostatized from the church. William wondered how they should deal with that situation. Section 85 was the Lord's answer. And who is this man being referred to in verse 8 there? Church historians aren't 100% sure, but more than likely it was referring to Edward Partridge, who apparently had begun to resolve some of these concerns in his own way, and perhaps even in opposition to Joseph's instructions. And the one mighty and strong mentioned in verse 7 as being a person who would replace him if he continued to act of his own accord. Thankfully, Edward Partridge did heed the prophet's warning, and no such measures were needed. That's the main gist of Section 85. But we want to really try to understand the reason for the reference to that Old Testament story. I think it contains a very powerful lesson that's applicable to all members of the church. So first, the story. If you look in the footnotes, you're going to see that they send you to 2 Samuel chapter 6 or 1 Chronicles 13. If you wanted to read the story directly from the scriptures, that's where you could go. But what I like to do is invite a student to come to the front and read a summary of the story in modern language. Help them understand it better. You could give that student a handout of the summary. And here's what it says. The streets of Israel buzzed with excitement. Music filled the air. People danced, shouted, and celebrated. Why? Because King David had decided to bring the Ark of the Covenant, the most sacred object in all of Israel, to Jerusalem. It was a big deal. The Ark represented the very presence of God. It had been carried through the wilderness, into battles, and now, finally, it was coming home. But there was a problem. Instead of following God's instructions to have the Levites carry the ark with long poles, David's men placed it on a wooden cart pulled by oxen. It was faster, easier, more efficient. And maybe they didn't think it was that big of a deal. After all, the ark was still moving in the right direction, wasn't it? Walking beside that cart was a man named Uzzah. He was close to the ark, probably honored to be part of such an important moment. But as the procession moved forward, the oxen pulling the cart hit a rut in the road. The cart rocked. The ark wobbled. Uzzah's heart jumped. In that split second, he decided to reach out, to steady it, to stop it from falling, to protect it. But the moment his hand touched the ark, he dropped to the ground, dead. The end. And this is really fun, especially if they're not familiar with the story. You just let them react to it. Ask them how they feel about it. And typically, they struggle with it a bit. But then you ask them what they think the moral of the story is, especially considering the historical background that we discussed earlier with Edward Partridge. You might need to help them out a little bit with this, but ultimately you want them to understand that steadying the ark means to seek to correct or supersede God's wisdom and authority. This story was God's way of saying, don't steady my ark. I don't need man to keep my affairs in order. I am well able to take care of my own things. I don't need man's puny arm to manage my kingdom. Instruction and counsel come from the top down, not vice versa. You could also share this quote from President David O. McKay. However well-meaning his intentions, Uzzah approached casually what could only be approached under the strictest conditions. He had no faith in God's power. He assumed that the ark was in danger, forgetting that it was the physical symbol of the God who has all power. What man can presume to save God and his kingdom through his own efforts? In modern revelation, the Lord referred to this incident to teach the principle that the Lord does not need the help of men to defend his kingdom. Yet even today, there are those who fear the ark is tottering and presume to steady its course. These are ark steadiers. The best intentions do not justify such interference with the Lord's plan. Discussion question you want to ask? Can you think of any possible examples of ark steadying today? And I give you some of my thoughts on that in the Insight video. And to emphasize the message of trusting in the Lord's servants, you could show the following video that's entitled, Listen to a Prophet. Following the prophet is a sure way to avoid steadying the ark. Now, our take it to heart question isn't something that you necessarily are inviting your students to share, but just to ponder, to think about it. We don't want our lesson to turn into confession time or an opportunity to express our frustrations or struggles with church leaders or policy. But ask them to ponder this. Have you ever felt frustrated with how something in the church was done? And how did you handle it? Our I will go and do question. Are there any areas in my life where I am seeking to steady the ark? What can I do instead? The takeaway slide depicts the story of Uzzah and reminds our students to seek to steady yourself, not the ark. Express that you know that it can feel tempting sometimes to take matters into our own hands, especially when things seem off balance or confusing. But God doesn't need us to fix His church. He just needs us to trust Him, follow His prophets, and keep our own hearts steady in the process. Testify to your students that God is in control. His hands are always sure, even when ours shake. So instead of reaching out to steady the ark, steady your faith. Let's be the kind of disciples who stand firm, even when it's hard to understand. Lesson number 2, harvesting hope. Truth. We should be slow to judge others because we may mistake someone's potential. What looks like a tare now may turn out to be precious wheat later, if given time, love, and patience. And I think we can get a fire in the bones for this lesson as we think about individuals that we know and love who at some point in their lives were not living worthily. But with time, they turned things around and now are dedicated disciples of Christ. I'm pretty sure that most people are going to know someone like that, or maybe we're the ones that have been there ourselves. This lesson can help our students to understand the power of mercy, the danger of premature judgment, and the miracle of transformation. Hopefully we can inspire them to become gatherers of wheat, not burners of tares. And for an object, a bundle of wheat, if you're able to find something like that near you. If not, you can actually purchase bundles of dried wheat online, fairly inexpensively. I'll provide a link to that if you're interested. But then 2 suggestions for the icebreaker. You could either do the pair of bowls riddle that I explained in the Insight video, or the parables matching handout. Or you could do both if you like. But those can serve as a fun introduction to the idea of interpreting a parable. Then explain the 3 steps of interpreting parables, which are list the elements of the parable, identify what they may represent, and ponder spiritual application. But first, they're going to need to hear the parable. It's not here in Doctrine and Covenants 86. This is an interpretation of it. But it is found in Matthew 13, 24, verse 30. So you could either read that with your class, or you could show them the church's Bible video of Jesus telling the parable. I'll provide a link to that for you. For the search activity, then, invite your students to use section 86, verses 1 through 7, to interpret the main elements of the parable. What do each of them represent? And have them share. But then I'd really zero in on verses 6 through 7 and ask them, what do you think the Lord means by these instructions? Why not pull the tares out early? And that question should lead us to what I feel is a major message of this parable. It's not the only one, but one that I like to focus on. And that is not to judge people's spiritual potential too early. Explain that wheat and tares look almost identical when they're young, but they're completely different in appearance when they're fully mature. You could use these pictures to illustrate that. And you may want to ask, why is it important that we don't try to weed people out too soon? How can judging too quickly damage someone's spiritual growth or potential? And then ask them if they know anybody who fits that description. People who may have looked like a tear at one point in their lives, but who were actually wheat all along. I like to share the example of my grandmother, who fits that description. A quote from Elder Uchtdorf: "We simply have to stop judging others and replace judgmental thoughts and feelings with a heart full of love for God and His children." A take it to heart question: have you ever misjudged someone, only to later realize that they were more righteous or sincere than you first thought? What did you learn from that experience? For what I will go and do, is there someone in your life right now who might seem like a tear, but who could actually be wheat in disguise? And what would it look like to treat them differently this week? Our takeaway slide reminds us to see the wheat in other people. Remind them to see people not just for who they are right now, but for who they can become, and treat people like they matter, because they do. And if we do that, maybe we'll find that some of the greatest wheat in God's field are the ones who surprised us most. All right, our final lesson: wars of the world. Truth: in the midst of growing war and chaos, our greatest safety is found by standing firm in holy places. Our fire in the bones for this lesson can be sparked by recognizing the turbulent world we live in, a world where conflict and chaos and division are all too common. And with this lesson, we can help our students see that amid the noise of discord and war, that there are places of peace that we can choose to stand in. And we can help our students to be better prepared to face a daunting future with confidence in Christ. For an object, you could get a set of plastic toy soldiers, the classic green ones, and set them up at the front of the class. I'll include a link to those. The icebreaker is a multiple choice question about the last days. The parable that we just studied in section 86 told us that the wicked are going to be destroyed at the second coming of Christ. All evil, all wickedness. So I ask, according to the scriptures, what is the major way in which the wicked are going to be destroyed in the last days? A, natural disasters. B, war. C, plagues and sickness. D, famine. Or E, burning. The answer to that question is B, war. Now, all of those signs are included in the scriptures, but the major cleansing element that you see in the most places is war. It's not that God has got to come down and send fire and destruction on everybody, but it's the wicked that destroy themselves in conflict and fighting. Well, section 87 is called the prophecy on war. You can show them that in the section heading. And then challenge them to find out what's ironic about the section heading. Irony is when there's an incongruity between what's expected and what actually happens or is expressed. So can they find an example of irony in the section heading? And the answer is that the revelation was received on Christmas, the day when people around the world were celebrating peace on earth, goodwill towards men. Perhaps this was the Lord's way of saying that, in general, from this point on, there would be no more peace on earth. You could show them some of these slides that show some of the conflicts that are going on right now and some of the major conflicts that have been taking place since section 87. For the search activity, have your students read the entirety of the section. It's short, and answer the following 4 questions. You could do this by either counting off students from 1 to 4 and then ask them to search for the answer to their question as they read it. Or you could give them this small handout with all of the questions and invite them to each search for the answers. And the questions are: 1. What specific war does Joseph Smith seem to be prophesying here in the first verses of the section? Number 2, is there any evidence that this section is speaking of more than just one specific war? 3, what will be the final result of these wars? 4, what is the solution to surviving these wars? And the Inside video has got a lot of answers and commentary on those questions. But one of the major messages that I like to emphasize is the answer to question number 4. The scriptures never present us with a problem without the solution being somewhere nearby. And our solution to the wars and conflicts of the last days is to stand in holy places. As we do this, we'll be protected from the devastating spiritual consequences of hatred, war, and conflict. A discussion question: what do you think it means to stand in holy places today? For the video suggestion, there's this one called Standing in Holy Places. As they watch, have them look for the various holy places the young lady in the video found strength in. Now a quote from President Nelson: "Whenever any kind of upheaval occurs in your life, the safest place to be spiritually is living inside your temple covenants." Please believe me when I say that when your spiritual foundation is built solidly upon Jesus Christ, you have no need to fear. Take it to heart question: in what ways have you found refuge from the calamities of the last days in the 3 holy places? And those 3 holy places are home, church, and temple. And I will go and do question: what holy place, home, church, temple, will I visit or prioritize this week? And what will I do there to strengthen my relationship with God? Now, our takeaway slide is going to emphasize this message of standing in holy places. Invite your students to look at their lives and ask, where am I standing? And if needed, to take a step closer towards the holy places, homes, churches, and temples, and promise them that that is where they're going to find safety, strength, and peace, even in a world of war. And that is going to conclude this week's supplemental teaching activities video. I hope it helps you. I hope it helps to spark the fire in the bones for teaching this week. Thank you so much for spending this time with me. Now get out there and teach with power.